timelines don't bend. They snap. Canada's $34 billion Trans Mountain expansion spent years as the national punchline, over budget, behind schedule, not expected to hit full capacity until 2027 or 2028. Through 2025, utilization hovered around 82 to 84%. Respectable. Unremarkable. Then the Strait of Hormuz locked up. Early 2026, conflict slashed vessel traffic through the world's most critical oil choke point, from 129 ships a day down to 4. 20% of global crude trade terminated overnight. Asian buyers scrambled for barrels outside the combat zone. The only major Western pipeline connected to Pacific tidewater, Canada's coast. By April, TMX slammed into the high 90s, pressing against its hard ceiling of 890,000 barrels per day, a pipeline the world wrote off maxed out in weeks. What followed reset the power balance across North America's entire energy map. And Washington's dependence on this grade of crude runs deeper than markets, locked into steel, concrete, and refinery architecture that no executive order can rewrite. Here's the engineering reality. The United States produces more crude oil than any nation on earth. Record output, headlines everywhere declaring energy independence. But step inside a Gulf Coast refinery complex, the actual beating heart of American fuel production, and that narrative falls apart at the molecular level. These facilities weren't designed for American shale. They were purpose-built for Canadian bitumen, and that distinction changes everything. Let me break down exactly why in 3 layers. First, chemistry. Light sweet crude from U.S. shale plays like the Permian Basin is thin, low in sulfur, and composed of relatively simple hydrocarbon chains. Heavy sour crude from Alberta's oil sands is a completely different animal. Dense, viscous, loaded with sulfur and tangled, complex molecular structures. Feeding light, sweet crude into infrastructure designed for heavy sour is like pouring jet fuel into a diesel engine. The chemistry simply doesn't match. Second, hardware. Over the past several decades, Gulf Coast refinery operators poured tens of billions of dollars into installing coker units, hydrocrackers, and desulfurization towers. Massive, specialized equipment mathematically engineered to crack apart heavy molecules and strip out sulfur compounds. Every valve, every catalytic bed, every pressure threshold in these systems is calibrated for one specific feedstock profile. As an Enbridge executive stated in February 2026, Canadian heavy crude remains the meat and potato staple of the U.S. Gulf Coast refining complex, not a supplement, the staple. Third, the switching cost. Data from the Canadian Energy Centre in 2026 confirms that U.S. Gulf Coast refineries structurally require Canadian crude for 23% of their total daily feedstock. If that supply disappears, these plants cannot simply swap in domestic shale oil. The viscosity is wrong. The sulfur content is wrong. The molecular weight is wrong. Retrofitting means billions of dollars in capital expenditure and years, not months, of engineering downtime. So the picture becomes razor sharp. America's most critical refining corridor goes beyond political alignment with Canadian oil. It's physically welded to it at the molecular level. But a lock only matters if the other side finally has somewhere else to go. A structural trap in Houston stays pure theory unless Canada has a physical route to send those barrels to a completely different buyer. And for the first time in history, it does. In finance, there's a foundational law every first-year analyst learns the hard way. Never concentrate your entire portfolio in a single asset. The moment that asset turns against you, you don't just lose money, you lose the ability to move. You're trapped. Nations work the same way, and for decades, Canada violated this rule at industrial scale. According to the Canada Energy Regulator, Canada was routing over 4 million barrels per day to a single customer. The United States, that volume represented 63% of all U.S. crude imports. Sounds like leverage on paper. In practice, a prison. With no alternative pipeline reaching tidewater, American refiners didn't need to compete for Canadian barrels. They named a price. Canada took it. the Western Canadian Select Discount, to WTI, the benchmark punishment for captive supply, ran between $15 and $20 per barrel, year after year. The oil was world-class. The sellers simply had nowhere else to go. I call this structural trap and its reversal the optionality multiplier. The principle is surgical. The moment a sovereign exporter opens even one credible alternative route, the pricing power of every existing buyer collapses. Not gradually, immediately. Monopoly pricing depends entirely on the absence of options. Add one and the whole equation reprices. That's exactly what the data now shows. Since TMX hit maximum throughput, over 60% of newly unlocked pipeline volumes have sailed directly to Asia, primarily China. Argus Media confirmed it. Statistics Canada trade data confirmed it. The math is unambiguous. The U.S. single buyer monopoly over Canadian crude is functionally terminated. Now pause on that for a moment. This shift deserves more than a line on a spreadsheet. We've spent decades watching this country leave leverage on the table, quietly absorbing discounts, quietly accepting dependency, quietly asking why we keep tying our own hands. But the second those loaded tankers cleared the Westridge Marine Terminal and hit open Pacific water bound for Asian refineries, that entire psychology shattered. Canada didn't negotiate its way out of a monopoly. It poured concrete and welded steel until the monopoly ceased to exist. And here's where the strategic payoff crystallizes. The USMCA, CUSMA, if you're being properly Canadian about it, faces its mandatory joint review on July 1st, 2026. The U.S. Trade Representative and Mexico have already begun bilateral pre-negotiations, deliberately sidelining Ottawa. 2 years ago, that isolation tactic would have worked. Canada would have walked into Washington as a dependent price taker, hat in hand, lobbying for exemptions. That posture is dead. Today, Canadian negotiators carry a physical instrument no talking point can replicate, a pipeline at full capacity routing premium crude to competing buyers. The WCS discount has already compressed to roughly $10 a barrel, billions flowing back into Canadian revenue, measurable and irreversible. Washington isn't sitting across from a supplicant. It's facing a diversified supplier holding a credible, scalable alternative client base, and in any trade negotiation, credible alternatives are the only currency that moves anything. But here's what most people haven't calculated yet. Winning back fair pricing from the U.S., that's the first order effect. The obvious one. What nobody in Washington is tracking closely enough is where those Asian-bound barrels are actually landing, and what kind of strategic vacuum they're quietly filling on the other side of the Pacific. The strategic vacuum is energy security, and it's enormous. Picture Tokyo, the world's fourth largest economy, a manufacturing juggernaut producing everything from semiconductors to next-generation automobiles. Here's the number that should stop you a cold. As of late 2025, Japan was 95% dependent on Middle Eastern crude. Every barrel funneled through two of the most contested chokepoints on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz and the Malacca Strait. Now picture Seoul. South Korea runs one of the most energy-intensive industrial bases on the planet. Shipyards, semiconductor fabs, steel mills, petrochemical complexes, and imports virtually every drop of oil that powers them. Same choke points, same dependency. If Hormuz closes for 3 weeks, South Korea doesn't slow down. It seizes up. Then there's India, the fastest growing major economy, industrializing at a pace that demands more imported crude every quarter. That crude flows overwhelmingly through the same Middle Eastern corridor and the same contested straits. The 2026 Hormuz crisis didn't create these dependencies. It detonated them. One disruption, one naval standoff, one miscalculation in the Persian Gulf, and 3 of Asia's largest industrial economies face existential shutdown. These aren't war game hypotheticals. They're the nightmares keeping energy ministers awake at 3 a.m. Their economies run on imported hydrocarbons the way your body runs on blood. Cut the supply for weeks, not months, weeks. and you get rolling blackouts, factory closures, and GDP contractions that make a standard recession look gentle. So when your traditional supplier sits behind two potential war zones, where do you turn? You look across the Pacific. What you find is a Canadian coastline with direct, unobstructed ocean access to every major Asian port. No choke points, no contested straits, no military flashpoints between the loading terminal and the refinery gate. The numbers confirm the pivot is already underway. Since TMX reached operational capacity, Canadian crude exports to the Indo-Pacific surged from a near-zero baseline to an average of 571 million Canadian dollars per month. The Asia-Pacific region now absorbs roughly 2/3 of all Trans Mountain volumes, 2/3 in barely 18 months. But here's where the story flips. By early 2026, Japan, South Korea, and India were actively elevating Canada from a secondary trade option to a primary Tier 1 strategic supplier, specifically to bypass Hormuz and Malacca vulnerabilities. Price isn't driving these purchases. Route security is. For a country that spent decades accepting punishing discounts because it had one buyer and zero alternatives, that inversion is seismic. They're not bargain hunting. They're paying a premium for uninterrupted delivery through geopolitically clean shipping lanes. So consider the full arc. A country dismissed for decades as a captive energy supplier, locked into a single North American buyer with no alternative routes, just became one of the Indo-Pacific's most critical energy security partners. The crude flowing west through those Rocky Mountain tunnels has transmuted into something far more valuable than a commodity. It's middle power, diplomatic capital, and Canada is only beginning to learn how to spend it. Now bring this back home, because inside Canada, a different vindication is playing out, one that rewrites years of political embarrassment in real time. You remember the narrative. Trans Mountain was the poster child of government waste. A pipeline that ballooned to $34 billion years behind schedule, mocked as the most expensive white elephant in Canadian history. Every budget overrun became a punchline. Every delay confirmed what critics always said: Ottawa can't build anything. That narrative is dead. When the Hormuz shock hit and Asian buyers scrambled for secure supply, TMX surged to near maximum capacity almost overnight. The only export infrastructure on the planet positioned to catch that panic-driven demand was a pipe through the Canadian Rockies that half the country had written off. In a single quarter, the entire strategic thesis behind that $34 billion, the demand model, the geopolitical necessity, the bet on Pacific tidewater, was permanently validated. Now here's what matters for the next decade. TMX's success instantly became the proof of concept for an entire class of Canadian mega infrastructure. Before this moment, institutional capital and provincial governments were paralyzed. The risk calculus on massive pipeline builds looked terrible. Regulatory gridlock, volatile commodity prices, endless political backlash. Nobody wanted to write the check. TMX's overnight profitability swept that hesitation off the board. What institutional investors saw was definitive. The Asian premium spread over Gulf Coast benchmarks wasn't a panic spike. It was structural. That single revelation collapsed the offtake risk that had paralyzed every private pipeline proposal for a decade. And the capex dominoes are already falling. Southbow Energy has proposed the Prairie Connector, 450,000 barrels per day of new capacity. The Alberta government is actively advancing the Northwest Coast oil pipeline, targeting 1 million barrels per day to Pacific tidewater. TMX itself is planning technical optimizations to add another 200,000 to 360,000 barrels per day. Added up, Canada is preparing to deploy up to 2 million barrels per day in new or upgraded export capability. One pipeline's vindication is forcing a structural identity shift from a captive, landlocked price taker discounting crude to Cushing, to a swing producer dictating terms to the Pacific Basin. But all of this, the steel, the capacity, the physical infrastructure, solves only half the equation. The truly seismic shift has moved beyond pipeline corridors into settlement systems. And what's unfolding there makes everything we've covered so far look like a warm-up act. For decades, the global oil market has operated on one unshakable assumption. Oil moves in barrels, but it settles in dollars. According to JP Morgan and IMF data through 2025, roughly 80% of all global oil transactions have been priced and settled in U.S. currency. The dollar still commands about 57% of global foreign exchange reserves. That's dominance. That's infrastructure, financial infrastructure, as real and as load-bearing as any pipeline ever built. But the numbers are telling a different story now. Cross-border trade settled in the Chinese yuan hit approximately 3.7% in 2024 per S&P Global. Sounds small until you realize it climbed from less than 1% in 2012. That's not noise. That's a trajectory, and it's accelerating for one very specific mechanical reason. Watch how this abstract financial pressure physically detonates at the most dangerous choke point on Earth. Picture a tanker approaching the Strait of Hormuz. Nearly a third of the world's seaborne oil threads through this corridor every single day. Now, when Washington weaponizes SWIFT banking networks to isolate Iran, cutting Tehran off from New York, clearing houses, severing all access to dollar settlement, it creates enormous financial pressure. Think of it like capping a high-pressure valve on one side of a pipeline. The flow doesn't stop. It finds another route. Iran still physically controls a strait through which roughly 20 million barrels transit daily. That leverage doesn't evaporate because a banking terminal goes dark. So the pressure seeks relief. And China, Iran's largest oil customer, provides exactly that outlet. The yuan becomes the path of least resistance. Not because the yuan is superior, but because the dollar made itself unavailable. In April 2026, Al Jazeera confirmed that Iranian-controlled checkpoints in the Strait of Hormuz began mandating certain vessels pay physical transit-related charges exclusively in Chinese yuan. At one of the most critical choke points in global energy logistics, the US dollar was actively refused. De-dollarization walked out of academic white papers and into enforced reality on open water. Now zoom out and hold both maps in your mind. On one map, you have the Middle East, a choke point where rockets fly, sanctions bite, and the currency regime itself is fracturing under geopolitical stress. Nearly a third of the world's seaborne oil passes through waters controlled by actors, actively building financial workarounds to American power. For any Asian buyer dependent on that flow, the risk calculus is existential. Your physical supply runs through a war zone, and the financial rails underneath it are splintering in real time. Now look at the other map. TMX is pumping Canadian crude to tidewater from a politically stable, treaty-governed democracy where nobody is shooting rockets at the terminal. Canada isn't just rerouting barrels away from U.S. dependency, it's offering Asian buyers something the Middle East structurally cannot: a geopolitically stable physical supply in an era when stability itself is the scarcest commodity on Earth. But here's where the story flips into full panoramic view. Most analysts track barrels or they track currencies, rarely both. Overlay the two maps and a structural rhyme snaps into focus. The East is architecting a financial alternative to the dollar at the very choke points where supply chaos originates. Canada is providing the physical alternative to that same chaos, reliable, stable, built on bedrock instead of contested straits. One pressure, two manifestations. The multipolar order isn't approaching. It's already being wired into the system, barrel by barrel, transaction by transaction. So the question lands, is everything we've just traced, the full capacity runs, the tanker redirections, the yuan settlements, a temporary windfall from a temporary crisis, or something that cannot be undone? Here's my verdict in one line. Empty promises and diplomatic rhetoric do not reshape global trade. Poured concrete and welded steel do. Let's run the reality test. Critics will argue this entire boom hinges on Hormuz instability, that once tensions ease, Asian buyers revert to Gulf suppliers, and TMX quietly fades back to underutilization. Yeah, it's a tidy argument. And it's wrong, because it confuses the trigger with the proof of concept. Yes, the Strait of Hormuz crisis created the opening. But what happened next is what actually matters. Hundreds of tankers physically redirected to Westridge Marine Terminal. Long-term offtake contracts inked with refineries in Shandong and Gujarat. A durable price premium established for Western Canadian Select delivered into the Pacific Basin. That sequence didn't describe a temporary anomaly. It described a route-proving commercial viability under live, hostile market conditions. And here's the part no critic can argue around: Sokrat, the pipeline itself. The Trans Mountain expansion became strategically decisive for one reason only. It already existed at the exact moment the global system needed it most. That physical capability, Canada's proven ability to bypass the continental United States and deliver crude directly into Asia, is now an operational, documented, irreversible fact. You cannot unbuild 980 kilometers of twinned pipeline. You cannot erase the shipping logs. You cannot undo a proof of concept witnessed by every energy trading desk on the planet. Optionality in the oil market is power, and Canada now holds a category of optionality it has never possessed in the modern era: the credible, demonstrated ability to redirect its most valuable export away from its only traditional customer. The optionality multiplier isn't theoretical anymore. It's welded, shut and flowing. Think about the weight of that. Canada's hidden leverage wasn't unlocked by a brilliant strategy paper or a bold political speech. It was unlocked by global chaos validating infrastructure already in the ground. As we enter the most fiercely contested era of 21st century resource diplomacy, that leverage is real, physical, and permanent. Which leaves exactly one question. We are heading into the COSMA trade review with the strongest hand we've had in 50 years. But do you think Ottawa actually realizes the leverage they hold, or will they blink? Let me know your read on our current leadership's negotiating backbone in the comments below.